The morning light drifted lazily through the sheer white curtains of the veranda, painting golden lines across the floorboards. Jinkee Pacquiao sat quietly, cross-legged, with a thick photo album resting on her lap. Her fingers traced the corners of faded pictures, their edges softened by time. Outside, distant laughter echoed, probably one of her grandchildren chasing a cousin through the garden. But here, in the stillness of this quiet room, her mind drifted decades back to a smaller, more fragile time. "Not all love starts with flowers," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone listening. "Some begin with fear." Back then, everything was simpler, and yet more terrifying. Manny was not yet a world icon. There were no bright lights, no arenas shouting his name, no championship belts hanging in glass cases. He was just Manny, a young fighter from General Santos, raw and hungry. He had big dreams, but even bigger absences, disappearing for training camps, coming home exhausted, bruised, and sometimes distracted. Jinkee smiled faintly as she recalled the early days of their marriage. Their house was modest, barely 2 rooms, and a fan that worked only if you hit it twice. They didn't have much, but in those rare moments between his fights and travels, they had laughter, prayers, and fried fish on the same old plate they washed every night. But beneath that laughter, beneath her quiet strength, lived a truth Jinkee never told anyone. Not even Manny. It was a rainy Thursday, barely 4 months into their marriage. She had woken up early, earlier than usual. She couldn't sleep. Her heart felt heavy. Her thoughts spiraled. The night before they had argued. Not about anything big, but about the weight of his schedule, the constant calls, the way he always seemed halfway out the door. He had kissed her forehead, distracted, as he packed his gym bag. She had said nothing, but inside something had cracked. That morning, while the rain tapped gently against the tin roof, Jinkee stood in the middle of their tiny bedroom, staring at the suitcase she had laid open. One by one she folded clothes, not in anger, not in a rush, but with the slow, careful hands of a woman breaking her own heart. "I didn't plan it," she would later whisper into the pages of her journal. "I just reached a point where silence didn't feel safe anymore." She folded her favorite blouse, the one Manny liked, a pair of shoes, a photo of them smiling on their wedding day, awkward and giddy. She looked at it for a long time. Something in her chest clenched. Was this it? Was this how her story would begin and end, with a suitcase and goodbye unsaid? Then the phone rang. She hesitated. It was still early. She picked up, and on the other end was Dionysia, Manny's mother, Nane. Her voice was calm but firm. "Anak, he doesn't know how to love with words yet," she said. "But he loves you. That I know. He just doesn't know how to show it. Not now. Stay a little longer. Give him a little more time." Jinkee stood frozen. Her knees felt weak. The suitcase sat like a weight behind her. She didn't respond. Just listened. Nane didn't press. She hung up gently, leaving the echo of her words hanging in the humid air. Jinkee turned to the suitcase. Slowly she unpacked each item, folding them back into the drawers as if nothing had happened. Manny came home that night smelling of sweat and eucalyptus oil. He didn't notice anything. He never knew how close he came to losing her, and she never told him. Years passed. The moment faded into the background of their life together. But it never disappeared. It lived like a shadow under the bed, a secret folded between sweaters, a truth buried under years of support and resilience. Jinkee kept that secret because she loved him. Not the man on the posters, not the fighter on pay-per-view, but the boy who used to count coins at the end of the day to buy them dinner. She stayed because she saw in him something more than just fists and ambition. She saw a heart trying to grow. But in those early days, her love came with fear. Fear that she would vanish inside his rise. Fear that she would always be second to the ring. She often wondered what might have happened if she had left that morning. Would Manny have become the same man? Would he have found someone else? Would his career have soared higher or crumbled under the weight of loss? But most of all, she wondered if he ever felt the same kind of loneliness she had lived with in those first few years, loving deeply, but silently. Now, years later, she sat with that old photo album and the secret still burning quietly in the back of her throat. It had grown heavier with time, not because it was a betrayal, but because it was an act of love he never got to witness. Manny, now older, wiser, a man of faith and family, still didn't know. He kissed her every morning and thanked God for their story. And every time he did, Jinkee smiled and carried that memory quietly, knowing that one day, maybe, she'd find the courage to tell him. But not yet. Not just yet. The world knows Manny Pacquiao as a legend, a fighter forged from hunger and prayer, a man who rose from the streets of General Santos to the bright, merciless lights of Las Vegas. His story is woven into sports history, pound for pound, victory after victory, titles and applause. But behind that meteoric rise, behind the gloves, the belts, the million-dollar purses, there was a quiet woman who never left his side, even when no one else noticed she was there. As Manny's name grew, so did the silence in Jinkee's life. In public, she smiled, always elegant, always supportive. Photographers loved her. Fans admired her poise. She stood beside him in every weigh-in, every post-fight press conference, every bruised and bloody triumph. But no one asked her how she felt. Not really. Not when the cameras weren't rolling. There were nights in hotel rooms when Manny returned late, sore and distracted, his mind still in the ring. He'd collapse on the bed, mumble something about training or interviews, and fall asleep before she could even ask how he was. Sometimes she sat beside him, brushing a hand across his forehead, wondering if he knew how lonely she felt. Wondering if he could see the part of her that had slowly begun to fade beneath the weight of his fame. She once told herself it was just a phase, that once things calmed down, once he found his rhythm, they'd have time again. But the truth was, Manny never stopped, not after the first title, not after the second. There was always a next fight, a next opponent, a next reason to be gone. She understood the dream, she admired the drive. But admiration can't always fill the silence in a marriage. One night in Macau, after a particularly difficult fight week, where they barely spoke more than a few sentences, Jinkee found herself alone in their hotel room. Manny had gone to meet with promoters. She sat at the writing desk, staring at a blank piece of hotel stationery, and then, without thinking, she wrote, "If one day I disappear, it's not because I stopped loving you, it's because I stopped recognizing myself." The words came quickly, a confession bleeding from the page. She wrote about the hotel rooms that felt like prisons, about the way she smiled for cameras and cheered from ringside, only to cry into pillows after the crowds had gone. She wrote about how love had turned into patience and patience into silence, but when she finished, she didn't sign her name. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her Bible. It stayed there, unread, for years. Jinkee never gave it to him. Not because she changed her mind, but because she feared what it would do. The truth was, Manny loved her, but he didn't know how to reach her back then. He didn't understand the cost of chasing greatness, how each mile he flew away from her was a mile she walked alone. There was a moment, years later, when she thought about leaving again, not in anger, but in quiet exhaustion. The love hadn't died, but it had grown thin, stretched by absence and unspoken feelings. She had built a home for their children, managed their lives, guarded his public image, prayed for his safety. And yet, so often, she felt like a beautiful shadow in someone else's story. But Jinkee was never just a shadow. She began to build her own strength. She turned to her faith more deeply. She found solace in scripture, in prayer, in being a mother. She spoke at women's gatherings, offered advice to those who felt unseen. And each time someone asked her about her marriage, she said, "Love is more than happiness. It's choosing to stay even when it's hard, especially then." Over time, she and Manny began to find each other again, slowly, carefully. He began to listen more. He started coming home earlier. There were no grand declarations, no perfect transformations, but there were little things, like the way he'd hold her hand in church, the way he'd look for her in a crowd, even when thousands were chanting his name, the way he'd pray with her before every fight, not just for victory but for peace. Still, she never told him everything. She never spoke of that letter, never mentioned the months she had slept in the guest room, telling him it was because the kids needed her, when really it was because she needed space to remember who she was. She never told him how close she came to walking away, because by then she had forgiven him, not because he asked, but because love without forgiveness eventually becomes a cage. Jinkee had made peace with the silence. She wore it like armor. But deep inside, the letter remained, a truth waiting quietly for the right time. Manny often said she was the strong one, that he wouldn't have survived without her, that every belt he won was half hers. He said it in interviews, to crowds, to friends, but Jinkee always wondered if he truly understood what it meant, what it had cost her to be that strong, because strength wasn't just holding him through victories, it was standing quietly through the nights when he forgot to ask how she was. It was raising children while the world celebrated him. It was praying for a man who didn't always know how to pray for her back. She kept the letter. She reread it some nights, the ink faded now, the corners worn. It reminded her of a version of herself she had once been, fragile, tired, unsure, and it reminded her of the choice she made not to leave, a choice she continued to make every single day, and in that quiet choice, she found her power. The sky above General Santos was soft that morning, clouds stretching across the horizon like threads of white silk, promising rain, but delivering only stillness. Manny Pacquiao sat quietly at the edge of their garden, a leather-bound Bible resting in his lap, his glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose. His thumb moved absent-mindedly across the corner of the page, but he wasn't reading. He was thinking, listening, waiting for something he couldn't name. Behind him, the house was still. The staff had been given the day off. The children were away. It was just the two of them now, as it had been at the beginning. Jinkee had asked for a moment, not out of urgency, but with a calm gravity that Manny recognized immediately, the kind of tone she reserved for things that mattered. He had seen that look on her face only a few times before, when their first son was born, when he announced his retirement for the first time, and once, quietly, on the night of his baptism, when she had cried not from sadness, but from a release years in the making. Now she carried that same silence, and he felt a small chill pass through his chest. She emerged from their bedroom slowly, holding something in her hands. It wasn't a letter exactly, not fresh or folded, not crisp with intention. It was soft around the edges, worn and nearly translucent, like something kept too long in a purse or the bottom of a drawer. He watched her as she approached, her eyes already wet, though she hadn't yet spoken. She sat across from him, silent for a beat, then another. The only sound between them was the faint rustle of trees outside and the distant hum of a passing tricycle on the main road. "I've been meaning to tell you something," she said finally. Her voice didn't waver, but it was low, as if afraid to break the peace around them, for a very long time. Manny nodded gently. "Okay." "I almost left you," she said. The words landed with such stillness that it took him a full moment to register them. His brows furrowed, not in anger but confusion. She watched him closely, not for reaction, but to hold him steady. "It was a long time ago," she continued. "Before Macau, before Vegas, before the world knew your name the way they do now. You were training constantly, traveling constantly. I would see you, but you weren't really there, not with me." She unfolded the paper slowly, placed it in his hands. He looked down at the faded hotel stationery, his own name written in the corner. No date, no greeting, just lines, raw and quiet. "If one day I disappear," he read aloud, voice catching, "it's not because I stopped loving you. It's because I stopped recognizing myself." His fingers tightened around the page as he read. He didn't finish aloud. He couldn't. His throat closed and he lowered the paper to his lap. "I wrote that in a hotel room in Macau," she said, voice steady. "You were off in meetings. I was alone. I felt invisible." Manny blinked quickly, as if trying to unsee the page or perhaps to force back the flood rising in his chest. He opened his mouth, but no words came. "I didn't give it to you," she added, "because I chose to stay. But that choice, it came with things I never told you, pain I never wanted you to carry. You were already fighting so much. She leaned forward, placing a hand over his. "But I need you to know this now, because we're not those people anymore. You're not that man. I'm not that girl in the hotel room. We've grown. We survived. And I forgave you long before you knew what needed forgiving." Tears filled Manny's eyes. He dropped his gaze to the paper again, as if trying to understand the weight of what she had carried alone. "I was so blind," he whispered. "All that time I thought you were okay. You never said anything." "I tried," she said, "in small ways. But you were surrounded by noise. I didn't want to become more noise." He stood, walked away a few steps, hand running through his hair. His shoulders trembled. And then, after a long silence, he turned back. "I failed you," he said, voice breaking. "I thought I was doing everything for us, for our family. But I see now. I never saw you." Jinkee smiled through her tears. "You see me now, that's what matters." He sat again, this time kneeling in front of her, holding both of her hands in his. He pressed his forehead against her knees. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Jinkee." And then he broke, not with a dramatic sob, but with a quiet unraveling. The kind of weeping that comes not from regret alone, but from deep, unspoken gratitude. Gratitude for a woman who stayed, who prayed, who folded pain into love and never used it as a weapon. They sat like that for a long time. Time didn't matter, neither did words. In that moment, there were no titles, no cameras, no past missteps. Just a man finally hearing the silence he had ignored, and a woman finally letting go of a weight she had carried far too long. Later, as the sky began to darken with the first hints of rain, Manny and Jinkee remained together, hands clasped. He didn't ask why she waited so long to tell him. He didn't need to. He understood now that some truths take years to grow strong enough to be spoken, and that love, real love, sometimes lives longest in the words left unsaid. That night, he tucked the letter into his Bible, the same one he opened every morning. It would live there now, not as a wound, but as a reminder of what they had walked through, of what they almost lost, of the strength it took to hold on. And in the stillness of their room, Manny turned to Jinkee and whispered, "Thank you for staying." She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I never stopped loving you, even when I thought I might have to leave." Outside, the first drops of rain finally fell, soft, slow, healing, and inside, something that had long been silent was finally at peace.